Friends, won't you pray with me for our time together tonight? O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. It sounds kind of fun, doesn't it? With today's verses in Acts 2, we find ourselves not only amongst the 12 disciples, but the 3,000 who have suddenly decided to join their ranks. And these 3,012 or so people have decided that as an outpouring of their newfound faith and their desire to be in community with other people who share in these life-altering, trajectory-changing types of beliefs, they're going to start doing community differently than the world around them. So they decide to sell whatever they had and pool all of their resources together so that whenever one amongst them had a pressing need, that need was met. But not only that, they decided to share more than just their financial resources. They shared their time. They shared their tables. They shared their prayers with one another day after day. They devoted themselves to learning together in the temple every morning and breaking bread together after. They gathered in ways that weren't just practical, but were joyful. And the text tells us that when it was time for them to eat food together, they did it all with glad and generous hearts. Gathered together for a meal. They praised God, and as they looked around at their ever-expanding table, they did so with the goodwill for all people in their hearts. It sounds kind of fun, doesn't it? Maybe it's the extroverted only child in me that makes this pitch sound somewhat appealing, but suddenly taking who you call family from 3 to 3,000, that sounds good to me. The idea of trading a culture of isolationism for one of interdependence, that sounds appealing. Of trading, this is mine, and this is yours, for this is all ours, and if we're going to get technical about it, it's actually God's anyway. That sounds like an appealing option. And it was. The author of Acts tells us that when they started doing this, when they started to give all of what they had and who they were to the process of being transformed in community, that's when other people wanted in. As they lived in relationship with one another day by day, God added to their number those who were being saved. And the timing of this matters because we don't know if these people who were joining the community in a second wave ever encountered Jesus in physical form. We don't know if they, like the initial 3,000, heard people start suddenly and miraculously speaking to them in their native languages from all over the continent, describing what good God has done. Yes, it's weird and wonderful and happens right before this in this text, and you should totally look it up. But these people, we don't know if they got that. We don't know if they ever saw any of the miracles that happened before this, for that matter, or even the one that the disciple Peter performs right after. All we know is that when these people saw some of the earliest Christians sharing life with one another with joy and with generosity, prioritizing openness and a sense of mutual care, that's when they decided they wanted to join their ranks. Seeing people willingly choose to be in community without choosing who is able to constitute that community, that was their miracle. The community was their miracle. And sometimes being able to maintain communities like that, where all are welcome. Sometimes being able to maintain communities like these, where all are welcome. It takes a miracle. Because the early Christians, not unlike our church, were bound together by common commitments. To listen to the divine whenever and however it spoke to them, and to love one another. But they all came at the shared goal from different vantage points. Some of them were probably ancient economists who were possibly watching the daily grain prices like a hawk and constantly doing the mental math to see how and when to buy enough food to feed a community the size of most cities. Some of them probably weren't skilled at math, mental or otherwise, and best expressed their love for community by adorning the walls of the temple with art. Others probably thought these folks spent too much on art supplies. And those folks, they loved their communities with calloused hands, building the very shelters that they slept in. Among the 3,000 plus new followers of Jesus, surely there was disagreement with that much difference in the mix. And I think this is a fair assumption for us to make because we know half the time the disciples couldn't even agree when there was only 12 of them. And yet, in this early community of Christian converts, they all came to the table with joy and gladness in their hearts, knowing that this was a place where they got to encounter difference. A place where people weren't invited to the dinner party by a selective Facebook invite that says no plus ones in parentheses, or with meticulously planned seating charts where only people with the same political views and cultural interest and who root for the same sports team were placed next to each other to maximize amicability and good vibes. That was not this. The only metric for who was included was whoever was there. And because they willingly submitted to a system where difference had a place within the whole, and yet they remained committed to caring for one another with joy, more and more people decided that this was an appealing option. What they were doing was building a church. What they were doing is building a church. Not just gathering, not just a group of like-minded individuals, but a church. A body made up of different members, all bringing what they had, even if what they had didn't always seem to match together just right. And that is a miracle, because community like this doesn't just happen. Not then and not now. It has to be chosen. It has to be tended. Because it's one thing to be swept up in the excitement of Pentecost. If someone showed up and started speaking to me in English when I know that they had no prior knowledge of English and started telling me about the Holy Spirit among us, I would be pretty excited too. And that initial excitement is great, but it's another thing entirely to keep showing up week after week with gladness just to be in community. To keep returning to the table with people who challenge you. Or people who you just don't know what to talk about next with and it feels awkward, or people who eat their food in a way that kind of irritates you, all of those people. But that's what they did. And they didn't do it begrudgingly. The text tells us they did it with joy. And that's what made it compelling. It's not just that the needs were being met, it's how they were being met. With open hands and with laughter around the table. This Tuesday night, I sat at my dining room table laughing too. I was looking at a Zoom screen populated by half a dozen or so faces that I've gotten to know really well over the past 2 years as we've all worked together on a social justice project for my home congregation. It's been really hard, sometimes disappointing, and often heartbreaking work. It has certainly been more than worth it, but it's been exhausting for the whole time we've been together. And this meeting was no exception as we gathered together to share our opinions about what the next right steps in our church's work for justice might be. Except for one thing. Except for the fact that I was wearing this purse, yes, a rubber chicken purse, on my head like a hat. Steph was there, she can verify. Another beloved congregant who I have always known to be only a serious person was wearing what I could only describe as like half of a Pokemon suit in their Zoom screen. And our fearless meeting leader, who is one of the most brilliant, meticulous, and well thought out people I know, was wearing not one, but 2 pairs of sunglasses on top of one another and a hat that looked like it would fit in perfectly at the Kentucky Derby. Another congregant, without breaking at all, just turned on her Zoom video and reached for a switch in the left corner of her room. And suddenly her hat was illuminated with Christmas lights that she had wrapped around it. She kept a completely straight face, and it was ridiculous. And it was oh so joyful. You see, our pastor had spent the day, her birthday nonetheless, helping complete a really important yet tiring part of this shared work. So one of the rest of us had brought the bright idea to join the meeting wearing ridiculous hats and purses of all varieties without telling the pastor so that she might log on and be surprised with just a laugh at the end of a hard day. And here's the thing. The joy didn't detract from the difficulty of the work, but it sustained us in it. Ridiculous hats didn't make the hard parts go away. They didn't solve the complicated dynamics or fix the systemic problems that we were facing. But they did remind us that even in the middle of it all, we were still a community that could laugh together. It reminded us that we still liked each other. We were having a good time, and there was a reason to delight. And that kind of joy, that kind of deep, sustaining, and shared joy, isn't trivial even if it looks ridiculous. It's sacred. It's sacred especially in church, because this is one of the few places where we don't get to choose our people. Not really. We don't get to hand select our fellow congregants based on compatible personalities or likability contests. The only metric is whoever's here. Whoever walks through the doors, whoever pulls up a chair, and that's the miracle. That we would still show up week after week and choose to love one another. Not because we're made from the exact same mold in the exact same way, but because we believe God is doing something in our very being together. That's what the early Christians were doing. That's part of what made their community magnetic. Not just that needs were met, but how they were met. With open hands and with laughter around the table. With glad and generous hearts stretched out wide enough to hold all of the differences within them. It's what made people stop and stare and say, wait, what's going on over there? That actually sounds kind of fun. They weren't compelling because they were efficient. They weren't compelling because they were all the same. They were compelling because they were joyful. And their joy was visible and shared and resilient in the face of every reason not to be. So if we're trying to follow their lead, maybe joy isn't just a side effect of Christian community. Maybe it's an integral part of the strategy. Maybe joy and gladness are not what distract us from the work, but what makes the work possible itself. Maybe it's not too sacrilegious to say that a rubber chicken purse and a Christmas light beach hat are doing sacred work too. Because when joy is present, it becomes easier to hope. And when hope is present, it becomes easier to stay. And when people stay through the mess and the difference and the hard days, and they weather it together with gladness to be in community, that's when church gets built. So let's keep making room for joy. Let's keep doing the ridiculous thing that lifts just one person's spirit. Let's keep building the type of community where glad and generous hearts are not only welcome, but a central part of what we're doing here. Because someone out there is watching. Someone out there is wondering whether a place like this could be for people like them. Someone is hungry for joy that doesn't ignore the hard things, but that coexists alongside them and invites more of us in. And if we can be that kind of church, where you don't get to choose who's at the table, but you choose to show up anyway, if we can keep setting that type of table with joy, then maybe, just maybe, some more folks will want to pull up a chair.